Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm your host Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Michelangelo Rossi, Associate Professor of Marketing at HEC Paris, as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Michelangelo Rossi is an associate professor of marketing at HEC Paris, where he teaches introductory marketing in the esteemed Grande École program. Professor Rossi earned his PhD in economics from Carlos III University of Madrid and served as a research affiliate at CES-IFO. Professor Michelangelo's research sits at the intersection of quantitative marketing, industrial organization, and competition policy, with a particular emphasis on digital markets and online platforms. Blending economic theory, econometrics, and causal inference. His work has been published in leading journals such as Management Science and Marketing Science. He also contributes to broader conversations on market dynamics through pieces in Harvard Business Review, and his research has been featured by media outlets including Cornell Chronicle and Market Watch. His contributions have received wide recognition, including the 2021 The Competition and Regulation European Summer School and Conference, and CPA Award for Best Paper on the Digital Economy, and a 2024 nomination for the Antitrust Writing Awards. Prior to HEC Paris, Professor Michelangelo held a faculty position as Assistant Professor of Digital Economics at Telecom Paris, Institut Polytechnique de Paris, and has a visiting scholar at institutions such as the University of Toronto and the CES-IFO Research Network. In today's episode, Dr. Michelangelo Rossi shares key insights from his acclaimed research, quality disclosures, and disappointment, evidence from the academic nominations. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michelangelo Rossi to the conversation. Professor Michelangelo, it's a distinct pleasure to welcome you to Business Talk. We are truly grateful to have you accepted our invitation.
Thanks a lot. It's a privilege also for me, and thanks for the introduction, the kind words. I hope that after such introductions, our people who are listening to this podcast don't have too high expectations that could result in disappointment.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, your paper shows that Oscar nominations can actually lower viewers' ratings of a movie, despite signaling high quality. How did you first realize that quality disclosures might have this kind of unintended downside?
Well, actually, it all started a few years ago when actually I invited the girl that later on will become my wife to the movie theaters. The movie in question was La La Land. At that time, there was a lot of buzz about the movie. We are talking about a movie that later on will receive a nomination and an award for the Oscars. And well, after going to the theater, I realized that probably the expectations we had about the movie were too high. On top of this, we also realized that neither me or my or what will become my wife really like musicals. La La Land is a musical. So from after that experience, I started to understand that quality disclosure signals like Oscars nomination and awards can affect how we perceived in this case movies, how we perceive products, and also can affect the selection of users who could watch a movie before or after a nomination.
Professor, you use a difference in differences design and then a novel recommendation-based matching approach to isolate the effect of nominations on satisfaction. Could you walk us through this matching idea in simple terms for non-econometricians?
Yes, sure. So here we are looking at ratings. Okay, so we have information. We have ratings from two platforms, but let me focus on the first one that is called the MovieLens. So we have ratings for movies that are nominated, are going to be nominated, and we have information about these ratings before and after for movies that are going to be nominated. And we also have a lot of ratings also for movies that are not nominated, are not going to be nominated. Okay. And we look at actually many years from 1995 until just before the COVID pandemic. Now, we start doing a diff, a difference in difference. That means to say, well, let's look at the average if you want. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but at least the intuition is, let us look at the average of the ratings before and after the nominations for the movies that are nominated. Now let's do the same, but for movies that are not nominated, but that, they have been produced the year before. So they could have been nominated that year, right? So if we do just this difference in difference, meaning we look at the first difference in two averages, and then before and after, and then we look at the same difference but for non-nominated movies, we do indeed observe a reduction in the average ratings for nominated movies compared to the non-nominated movies. And okay, we could interpret this as disappointment, meaning that users have now higher expectations, and because of this, you could have a reduction in the average ratings. But one could also say, well, people who are watching, give me the example of La La Land. For people who are watching La La Land before the nominations, probably they could be musical enthusiasts, right? Whereas people who are watching it after, they may not like adult musicals. So what we are observing here is not actually disappointment, but it's simply the fact that different people have different tastes, and you are attracting. After a nomination, much more people are indeed interested in watching a movie, even if they do not know, or at least they do not have a perfect understanding about the style, the genre of the movie. So this is the first thing, the first difference. So in order to disentangle, in order to identify disappointment and disentangle it from selection, what do? We actually use this recommendation-based matching. That what do? Essentially, we do something that is not that different compared to what many streaming platforms are currently doing. Think, for example, about Netflix, right? So you could think that now using only ratings that are posted before the nominations for many, many movies, we try to implement our recommendation systems. So we have predicted ratings for all the movies, right? For every users we have, for every consumers we have in our platforms. So in this way, what we could do, we could say, okay, so maybe we have some users who are watching and rating the movie before nominations. Then we can match these users with other users who have watched the movies after the nominations, but these two users, they have very, very similar recommendations, right? Something like they have very similar preferences, we could say. And once we look at the differences between ratings of ratings for these groups of users that have now very similar preferences, so we don't have any more musical lovers versus people who do not like musicals as in the previous example. What do? We actually still observe disappointment.
Professor, one of your key findings is that users who rate a movie after its nomination give significantly lower ratings than very similar users who rated it before. What does this tell us about how expectations shape the movie watching experience?
Yes, exactly, right. So the disappointment effect that we talked about is the result of the fact that there is a change in the type of expectations users have before, probably without knowing that the movie is nominated with the Oscars. They may not have such a high expectation, and now they could watch it with higher expectations, and possibly the movies are not living up to these expectations.
Professor, the disappointment effect is strongest among less experienced users on MovieLens and appears even larger on IMDb. Why do you think experience and platform composition matter so much for how people react to awards?
Well, as we talked, as I said before, right? The story about disappointment is a story about expectations. So about expectations and about how our beliefs are formed and how strong they are. So you could expect that experts, so if you know very well whether a movie is good or not, right, or at least is good or not for you, right? Well, then I mean, having an Oscar nomination does not change much your expectations. Whereas if you are not an expert, probably you go to the movie theaters 1, 2 years, two times a year, maybe just after or before a nomination, then actually this signal is much more important. And just to conclude, also related to the two platforms, we do observe that on MovieLens, compared to the average users on IMDb, these users seems to post much more ratings. So we interpret these as experience, as expertise.
Professor, you carefully rule out alternative explanations such as disinterest, worse viewing conditions, and snob effect. Which of these competing stories was hardest to distinguish from disappointment in the data? And how did you manage to separate them?
Yeah, so that was not an easy task necessarily, because our main result relates to ratings, numerical ratings, the stars, right? That we are observing in multiple platforms. But again, with stars, with numerical ratings, this decrease, it's not easy to say that this is disappointment or could be another behavioral change. So what do? We have some information about textual pieces of information on MovieLens, and we have information about text reviews on IMDb. And with a sentiment analysis, we are trying to look at different type of sentiments, or at least different types of channels, the ones you just mentioned, that that could affect our results. And we do observe that the sentiments that are more related to disappointment seems indeed to be the major driver of our results.
Professor, the paper combines ratings data with rich textual analysis of text and reviews, including transformer-based emotion detection. What did the language of disappointment users reveal that raw star ratings alone would have missed?
Exactly, right? So with just raw data, what can this could be, could be disappointment, but could also be that now suddenly the movie theaters are packed with people, and to some extent you are not only rating the movie, but also you rate the conditions in which you are rating, for example. So with this textual analysis, we are, for example, able to discard this issue. Now, of course, before you also mentioned, for example, snobbed effect, right? So the fact that since everybody is now talking about the movie, I want to separate myself from the others. This, of course, becomes it becomes more and more complicated to disentangle disappointment from that, because, of course, this could be, I don't want to say similar, but connected to how do we perceive the movies, so the objects that we are going to review.
Professor, many industries use third-party certifications, Michelin stars, hotel ratings, top picks, labels online. Based on your evidence from the Oscars, in what kind of market do you expect disappointment from quality disclosures to be most severe?
Well, as we mentioned already before, right? In order to have disappointment, you need to have uh, beliefs that can be changed by quality disclosures, right? So if we believe, for example, right, that in the fine dining industry, uh, users who are thinking to go to a very expensive restaurants have a pretty good idea about or pretty good beliefs that are pretty strong about the quality of the restaurants. We could expect that maybe adding an extra star on the Michelin could not have such a large effect. But this again is outside of our findings, but just my speculations.
Professor, from a platform or studio perspective, your results are a bit unsettling. Pushing awards and accolades may boost demand but lower satisfaction. If you were advising a streaming platform, How would you suggest they present awards to manage expectations better?
Yeah, I mean, really would like to touch with your last words, right? Managing expectations. Because on one side, we do observe, as you correctly point out, that those users who are very similar preference compared to those who have watched it before, right? They indeed we do observe a decrease in ratings that we could think that is a decrease in satisfaction. On the other side, we also have many more people. We have this expansion of demand, right? So we could say that probably what is most important, right, is that to try to manage expectations for different type of users, right? So if I would have not watched that movie if it wasn't for the nomination, then to some extent the understanding what disappointment is in this situation is much more complicated. But probably studios or those who are are say are certified by uh, uh, like an award similarly to the Oscar nomination, they have to take into account that those people who will have watched no matter what, well, they could get disappointment, so they have to make sure to manage their expectations for this group of people, to this group of users.
Because your study focuses on a relatively short time window around nominations. Do you see this disappointment effect as a short-lived reaction, or would it have longer-run consequences for word of mouth, franchisee value, or trust in awards themselves?
I do believe that the disappointment may have a medium run, long run effect. But of course, let's be clear here. Uh, Disappointment and expectations are affected by many things, right? Many events, marketing campaigns, for example. So the reason why we wanted to focus on a short term, on a few days before and after the nomination, is to make sure, or at least reduce the possibility of contamination from other information, other events that could, to some extent, had an effect, confound our parameters, our coefficients.
Professor Roji, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, how might your methodology be applied beyond movies? For example, to bestseller badges in e-commerce or editor's choice labels in app stores? And what open research questions are you most excited to explore next?
Yeah, so I do believe that indeed it is very interesting to look at the examples you mentioned, also before you mentioned Michelin stars, right? So I would say that we could use some similar techniques compared to what we used, although and this and this is the one of the reasons why we focus on movies and the Oscar awards is that usually if say a Michelin star restaurant receives an award, an extra star, for example, or say certain firms receives an award or a certifications. Well, there is at least one dimension that clearly changes, that are prices. If at one point you are certified as being the greatest podcaster ever, possibly, right? You could even think to charge for this podcast, right? So obviously, if then you want to measure disappointment, or you want to measure how the perceived what is the perceived satisfaction of your users, clearly that a possible change in price could affect their utility, right? So in all the situations that you are mentioning here, we could definitely have a change in prices that will make you know, uh, our life as a researcher, or at least our life as a interested in disappointment, much more complicated. But probably actually because it's so complicated, you could think that we definitely want to study this and want to understand how prices, expectations, and disappointment may affect satisfaction. So I find specifically that this approach could be of interest for future researchers and also for our understanding of these awards.
Thank you, Professor Michelangelo Rossi, for such an insightful and thought-provoking conversation. Your work on how quality disclosures like Oscar nominations can unintentionally generate disappointment gives us a complete new lens to understand consumer experience and expectations. It is not only deepen our appreciation of the movie industry, but also speaks to how signals, ratings, and certifications shape behavior in many other markets. We are grateful that you took the time to unpack complex methods and rich data in such a clear and engaging way, and to share the broader implications of your research for platforms, policymakers, and everyday consumers. I'm sure our listeners will look into award-winning labels very differently after this episode. Professor Rosie, thank you once again for joining us on the podcast. It has been a real pleasure to having you, and we look forward to following your future research as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.